They say time heals all wounds, but sometimes it just places them in a wooden box and slides that box onto the highest shelf, hoping no one asks about it again. Clara Monroe was 70 years old when she touched her violin case for the first time in half a century. Not because she missed the music, not because someone begged her to play, but because one quiet morning in the stillness of her living room, she heard something louder than regret: silence. The kind that asks, what would have happened if you never gave up? She hadn't opened that case since she was 20. Back then she was a promising student ready to take the stage, until one mistake, one comment, one cold judge's glare told her she wasn't enough. So she closed the case and kept it closed. For 50 years, it followed her. From her first apartment to the house she raised her daughter in, to this quiet corner in Redding, California, always present, always untouched. Until the day someone asked her a simple question. "Do you still play?" Clara smiled. "I used to." But what came next wasn't about recitals or redemption or proving anything to anyone. It was about opening a box, not just the one made of mahogany and velvet, but the one inside her where 1,000 unplayed notes were waiting. This is the story of a woman who didn't need a stage. She just needed to listen to the music still living quietly within her. In the far corner of Clara Monroe's living room, behind a faded armchair and beneath a dusty skylight, sat a violin case no one ever asked about. It wasn't displayed proudly, and it wasn't hidden either. Just there, quiet, unbothered, untouched. For most people, it looked like any other storage piece. But for Clara, that case was a sealed chapter, the kind you don't revisit, not because it's unimportant, but because it meant too much. She hadn't opened it in 50 years. It had followed her through every stage of life, from dorm rooms to married life, from a buzzing classroom where she taught history to this quiet home in Redding, California, where morning tea and crossword puzzles had replaced recitals and sheet music. She used to be promising, a scholarship student at a respected conservatory. Her instructors praised her technique, her posture, her control. But when the day of her solo came a small performance, a simple stage, something inside her collapsed. Her hands didn't shake, her notes didn't falter. But halfway through the piece, she looked up. The room was too still. And then came the voice she'd never forget. Technically fine, but no presence, no feeling. "You play like someone afraid of being heard." It wasn't shouted. No one laughed, but something inside her folded. She didn't cry, she didn't argue. She just went home, closed the violin into its case, and the next day changed her major from music to education. Clara never gave it away, never tuned it, never told her daughter about that day. Sometimes while dusting the shelf, she'd run her hand across the case's leather handle. The sensation was always the same, like touching the spine of an old book you never finished. Because that's what it was. A story interrupted, a voice silenced by a single sentence. And for 50 years the violin didn't make a sound, not because it was broken, but because Clara wasn't ready to listen. But then one day, someone asked her a question she hadn't heard in decades. "Do you still play?" And what happened next began with a pause, and a soft tremble in her fingertips. It came on a Tuesday tucked between a grocery run and an afternoon nap. Clara Monroe was standing in the produce aisle at Dalton's Market, deciding between 2 bags of spinach when she heard someone call her name. It was Evelyn Parks, a friend from the library's book club, always full of stories and too much perfume. She walked over with her usual energy and said, "Clara, I heard you used to play the violin. Is that true?" Clara blinked. It had been years since anyone had asked her that. "Used to," she said softly. Evelyn smiled. "We're putting together a small talent show for the elementary school fundraiser. Just a few community faces performing something from the heart. Nothing big. I thought maybe you might consider playing something." Clara froze spinach forgotten. She offered a polite laugh, brushing the idea aside. "Oh no, I haven't played in decades. I wouldn't know where to begin." Evelyn waved a hand. "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be you." That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table long after the tea had gone cold. She couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn's words. "It just has to be you." But that was exactly the problem, because for Clara, playing the violin had never felt like just being herself. It had once been her ambition, her identity, her almost career. And now the idea of playing again felt like opening the curtains too wide. What if they looked? What if they listened? really listened and still heard nothing. Clara wasn't afraid of being seen as old. She was afraid of being seen as empty. That's the fear we don't talk about as we age. Not the wrinkles, not the slower steps, but the quiet terror that maybe the most meaningful parts of us are already behind us. So, she didn't say yes. But she didn't say no either. She just went to the hallway closet, pulled down the old violin case, and placed it gently on the table. She didn't open it, not yet, but for the first time in 50 years, she left it there in the light like a question waiting to be answered. The next morning, Clara Monroe made herself a cup of chamomile tea, but forgot to drink it. She just stood at the table, hands resting on the closed violin case like it was something fragile and sacred. She hadn't slept much the night before. Her mind had been looping through Evelyn's question, "Do you still play?" A simple ask, but the weight of it had cracked something open. Now the case was in front of her. For the first time in 50 years, it wasn't hidden behind a row of photo albums or quietly buried in the back of her hall closet. She opened the latches. They clicked softly, same as they had the last time she touched them. Inside the violin lay nestled in its velvet lining like a memory that had refused to fade. The wood was darker than she remembered, the strings slightly loose but still intact. A fine layer of dust clung to the bridge like time itself had been holding its breath. She lifted the violin slowly, hands trembling not from age, but something older than that. Something heavier. Guilt. Clara had been a conservatory student when it happened. She was preparing for a spring concert, a small solo piece with piano accompaniment. Nothing grand, but important enough that she'd been rehearsing for weeks. Then the call came. Her father had collapsed. A sudden stroke. Her mother's voice on the phone was sharp with urgency. "If you want to see him, you need to come now." But the recital was that evening. Clara stayed. She told herself it was what her father would have wanted, that he believed in disciplined commitment, that she couldn't just walk away from months of work. She played, she bowed. The performance was technically clean, her bow steady, her fingers precise. But when she arrived at the hospital the next day, it was too late. Her mother never said it outright, but Clara always felt it. She had chosen the wrong moment to be professional, and worse, she had chosen the violin over goodbye. She packed the instrument away that night. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just closed the case and a piece of herself with it. Over the years, she told people her joints ached too much, that the strings were brittle, that it was just a childhood phase. But deep down, Clara knew the truth. She didn't stop playing because she failed. She stopped because success had cost her something she could never replace. That morning, with the house still quiet, Clara placed the violin beneath her chin. She drew the bow gently across the lowest string. The note came out uneven. It cracked slightly at the end. But it filled the room in a way nothing had in decades. And in that broken sound, she didn't hear shame. She heard release. Because guilt is like a note left hanging, it doesn't resolve until you return to it, even if your hands shake, even if the sound isn't perfect. The spare bedroom had always been just that, spare. An unused dresser, a quiet corner chair, and a dusty music stand that had followed Clara Monroe through 3 different homes without ever being fully unfolded. But now, for the first time in decades, she had opened it. The violin rested in her lap. A sheet of simple scales sat on the stand. The door was closed. And still she couldn't move. Her fingers hovered over the strings. Her bow sat still. Her breath shallow. There was no audience, no critic in the front row, no judgmental professor waiting to point out what she lacked. And yet, she felt watched. Watched by the version of herself who once dared to dream big. Watched by the girl who left the stage feeling broken. Watched by the woman who buried her music inside a locked case and never spoke of it again. We often believe fear is loud, that it shows up as stage fright or trembling hands in front of a crowd. But the truth is, some fears live in silence. They whisper, not scream. What if I'm no longer who I was? What if the music doesn't sound like me anymore? What if it never did? Clara tried again. She placed the bow gently on the A string and pulled a single note from the wood. It came out shaky, off pitch, the kind of sound she would have cringed at in her youth. But she didn't cringe. She closed her eyes. Because in that trembling, imperfect note, she heard something raw, real, not performance, but presence. She rested the violin on her lap again and looked out the window. A breeze moved the curtain slightly, and a shaft of sunlight hit the corner of the rug where Richard used to sit and drink his evening tea. She smiled, not because she had played well, but because she had played it all. And for the first time in years, Clara realized she wasn't trying to reclaim her past. She was trying to meet herself where she was now. Older, slower, but still here. We don't always fear judgment from others. Sometimes we fear being truly present with ourselves. Because once we stop performing for imaginary audiences, we're left with just our truth, flawed, quiet, beautiful. That evening, Clara packed up the violin with a little more care, not to put it away, but to take it somewhere. She'd heard the community center had a few private practice rooms left unused in the late afternoons. Maybe she'd go, just for a little while, just to play freely. The community center on 5th and Pine was a place Clara Monroe had passed by for years, but never entered. She'd seen kids rush out with paint-covered hands, older couples walk in for bingo night, and teenagers dragging their feet toward after-school programs. But this time, it was her turn. She had called ahead, asking quietly if they still had practice rooms. The young woman on the phone said yes, and added, "They're usually empty this time of day. You'll have privacy." That was all Clara needed to hear. She arrived just before 4 p.m., violin case in hand, scarf tied neatly around her silver hair. The receptionist, probably younger than her granddaughter, gave her a kind smile and pointed toward room 3 at the end of the hallway. The room was small, just a chair, a foldable stand, and faint marks on the wall where music posters used to hang. Clara sat, unlatched her case, tuned her strings, took a deep breath, and then she noticed it. The door wasn't fully shut. Someone had left it slightly ajar, just a sliver. She considered closing it, but something in her paused. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. She placed the bow on the string, drew it slowly. The note came tentative, gentle, flawed. Then another. Then a third. Each tone filled the space with something the room hadn't heard in a long time. It wasn't a song. It wasn't even a warm-up. It was Clara learning to be heard again with the door open. 10 minutes in, she felt it a shift in the air. She turned slightly, and there, seated quietly just outside the door, was a girl. Maybe 12, maybe 13, legs crossed, backpack still on. She wasn't filming, she wasn't whispering, she was just listening. Clara stopped playing, surprised. The girl stood quickly. "Sorry, I didn't mean to. I've never heard real violin before." Clara's heart softened. "It's okay," she said, voice steady. "It's been a long time since I played it too." The girl looked at the instrument wide-eyed. "It's beautiful." Clara smiled. "She's old, but she still has a voice." That afternoon, Clara stayed a little longer, not to impress, not to perform, but to remember what it felt like to be witnessed without expectation. Sometimes the quietest connections are the ones that bring us back to life, and the bravest thing we can do is play with the door open even just a little. A week after Clara Monroe's first open-door practice at the community center, an envelope arrived in her mailbox. No return address, just her name, handwritten in blue ink. The kind of handwriting that felt young, slightly rushed, a little uneven, but full of heart. Inside was a folded note torn from a spiral notebook. The first line read, "Dear Ms. Monroe, I'm not sure if you remember me, but I remember you." Clara sat down slowly. She hadn't been Ms. Monroe in years, not since she retired from teaching history at Reading High School more than 2 decades ago. She had taught hundreds of students, some talkative, some forgettable, a few unforgettable. The letter continued. "You taught me in 10th grade. I wasn't a good student. I used to sit in the back, draw on my notebook, and tell myself you didn't notice. But, of course you did. You always did. You were strict, quiet. We used to joke that you were made of stone." Clara chuckled softly, both amused and a little wounded. She remembered those days well, how tired she was, how much of herself she'd buried beneath professionalism. No violin, no music, no softness, just routines. The letter went on. "But yesterday, my niece sent me a video. It was from the community center. You were playing violin, just a little melody, but I recognized your face immediately, and I couldn't stop crying. I realized I never really knew you. None of us did. We thought you were cold, but maybe you were just quiet. Maybe you were carrying more than we saw. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd asked." Clara read that last line 3 times, not because it hurt, but because it healed something. We spend so much of our lives being misread, and sometimes the versions of us that people carry are incomplete snapshots taken in passing without context, without compassion. But every once in a while, someone sees a new image one that rewrites the old one. And that's what this letter did. Because no one is ever only who they were. And sometimes the most powerful apology isn't, "I'm sorry," but simply, "I finally saw you." Clara folded the letter, placed it beside her violin, and looked out the window. In that moment, she wasn't Ms. Monroe the teacher, or Clara the widow, or the old woman with shaky fingers. She was simply a woman rediscovering the parts of herself she had once decided were too hard to carry. There's a rhythm to regret. It doesn't crash in like guilt or sting like shame. It lingers. It loops. It taps on your shoulder when things get quiet, like the faint ticking of a metronome you forgot to turn off. Clara Monroe knew this rhythm well. It played in the back of her mind every time she lifted the violin. Every time she ran her fingers down the strings, she felt it, the steady pulse of what could have been. She didn't talk about it often, not even to Lily, her daughter, not even to Richard when he was alive. But the regrets were there, small and sharp. Not auditioning for that summer symphony, leaving the conservatory without saying goodbye, packing away her violin when her hands were still young enough to master anything. But lately, the rhythm had changed. It no longer beat like an accusation. It sounded more like a question. What if you played anyway? The children at the community center were the ones who truly shifted it. They began showing up more often, not asking for full lessons, just lingering near the open door, then sitting closer. Eventually, one asked, "Can you show me how to hold it?" Then another, "What's that note called?" Again. Soon they were gathering in a loose circle around Clara each Wednesday afternoon, violin or no violin, listening to her talk about notes, posture, and the way you should breathe before you play. No one was graded. No one was compared. No one tried to be perfect. It was the kind of learning Clara had always dreamed of giving, not about excellence, but about expression. One afternoon, after helping a shy boy hold a bow correctly, Clara paused. She realized something. She wasn't playing despite her regrets anymore. She was playing with them, letting them guide her, not choke her. That's when she knew regret doesn't go away by erasing the past. It softens when we begin to move forward anyway. When we carry the weight of what we didn't do, and still choose to do something now. Clara had once played only for herself, then not at all. Now she played with others not to impress, but to connect. And in doing so, the rhythm inside her finally shifted. It wasn't regret anymore. It was release. Clara Monroe never intended to teach again. She had spent a lifetime in the classroom, chalk dust on her sleeves, attendance sheets, and the quiet satisfaction of students who finally understood the Civil War, or why commas mattered. But after retirement, she told herself she was done being Miss Monroe, done with schedules, done with correcting posture and behavior, done with explaining the same thing 5 different ways to 5 different learners. But life, like music, has a way of repeating themes you thought were finished. What began as one girl listening outside the practice room became 2, then 4. At first, Clara would simply nod in greeting. Then she began showing them small things: how to hold the bow, where to place their fingers, how to keep their wrists relaxed. There were no sign-up sheets. No lesson plans, just folding chairs, borrowed violins, and a lot of patience. Before long, Wednesday afternoons turned into something regular. The kids started calling it Clara's Circle. No one knew exactly who started the name, but it stuck, probably because it felt right. There was no front of the room, no lecturing, just one big circle where everyone tried, missed, laughed, and tried again. One boy, Mateo, had trouble with focus. He couldn't hold the bow without tapping it on his leg like a drumstick. Clara didn't scold him. She gave him a rhythm exercise instead. Another girl, Lena, refused to play in front of others. Clara let her sit beside her during group time and whispered instructions just to her. By the 3rd week, Lena was the one showing new kids where to place their fingers. Clara never once referred to herself as a teacher, but the kids didn't need her to. They watched how she carried the violin like something sacred but not untouchable. They heard how she talked about music like a language anyone could learn. And most of all, they saw how she never laughed at wrong notes, only smiled and said, "Play it again, but this time, mean it." And so, the violin class that was never meant to exist became something bigger. Not a course, not a program, a gathering of shaky hands and sincere hearts. Because the best teachers aren't the ones who command a room, They're the ones who quietly make space for others to bloom. And as Clara watched her circle grow, she didn't feel old. She felt rooted, like something planted long ago was finally beginning to grow. It wasn't supposed to be a performance. The idea came from Mateo, of all people, the restless, fidgety boy who could barely sit still during scales. One afternoon, as the group packed up their instruments, he blurted out, "We should play something together, for real, like a concert." Clara smiled, assuming it was just a passing thought. But the next week, Lena brought it up again, then Ava, then two others. They didn't want a big crowd, no stage, no bright lights, just a simple gathering. "We could do it in the garden," Lena suggested, pointing to the courtyard behind the community center. "There's shade, and it smells like mint back there." Clara hesitated. She hadn't played in front of more than a handful of people in half a century. The thought of standing with a bow in her hand, while others looked on, still made her palms sweat. But this wasn't about solos. It wasn't about perfection. The kids weren't asking her to lead. They were asking her to stand with them. On the day of the recital, folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle. Parents, siblings, neighbors, and even a few curious passersby found their way into the garden. There were no microphones, no stage curtains. Just Clara's circle, a patchwork group of beginners holding slightly out-of-tune violins with nervous energy and proud smiles. Clara wore a simple blouse and soft blue scarf. Her violin, polished and tuned, rested gently in her hands. She looked around and saw faces, not critics, not judges, just people. People who showed up. The group began with a simple melody. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." Nothing fancy, but played with more heart than any stage could hold. And then, in the middle of the third piece, the kids nudged her. "Miss Clara," they whispered, "your turn." Clara stepped forward. Her hands trembled just slightly as she lifted the violin. But when the bow met the string, her eyes closed. She didn't think about her old professor. She didn't think about the missed opportunities or the long years of silence. She just played. A slow, sweet tune, one she used to hum while washing dishes, one Richard always called the sound of home. The final note faded into the wind. For a few seconds, there was only stillness. Then applause, warm, soft, real. Because the most honest performances don't need a spotlight. They just need a reason. And sometimes the reason is simply, because I can. Clara looked at her students. Their eyes shone. Not because she played perfectly, but because she played with them. The violin case no longer lived in the back of a closet. It now sat on a bench near the sunniest window in Clara Monroe's living room, unlatched open like an old friend finally welcomed back into the light. She didn't pack it away after the recital. She didn't feel the need to, because some chapters aren't meant to be closed again. Every morning, she would make tea, open the window, and play a few notes. Sometimes whole songs, sometimes just a phrase she wanted to feel her way through. There was no routine, no schedule, just breath and strings and time. She didn't play for anyone else, not the neighbors walking past, not for social media, not even for Lily. Though her daughter now called more often and always asked, "Played anything beautiful this week?" She played to hear herself, to reconnect with the voice that had waited patiently inside her for decades, not in her throat but in her hands, her memory, her courage. One afternoon, Clara brought the violin to the park near the library, not for a concert, not for a lesson, just to sit, to feel the wood warm in the sun. A little girl with tangled curls approached and asked, "What's that?" Clara smiled. "It's something I used to be afraid of." The girl giggled. "Are you afraid now?" Clara shook her head. "No, I learned to listen. There's a quiet kind of healing that doesn't make headlines. It's not dramatic. It doesn't ask for applause. It shows up when you stop proving and start being, when you no longer ask if your story matters, because you've already chosen to live it." Clara didn't become famous. She didn't get a record deal. But her music reached people, the students in her circle, the strangers in the garden, the younger version of herself, who once walked off stage in tears. And now when she plays, that version of her smiles too. Because the greatest applause doesn't come from a crowd. It comes from within the moment you realize you didn't need permission to begin again. And so, the case stays open, the strings stay tuned, and the woman who once went silent now plays not louder, but clearer. If Clara's story found you in a quiet moment of your own, we hope it whispered something true. And if it did, maybe now's the time to ask yourself, what part of me is still waiting to be heard?